Welcome to the College of Human Sciences and Humanities Presents, a video-based lecture series featuring the work of faculty from the largest of the 4 colleges at the University of Houston, Clear Lake. I'm Interim Dean Samuel Gladden. The College of HSH features almost 30 academic programs at the bachelor's, master's, and doctoral levels. Our disciplines are diverse, and our remarkable faculty are committed to innovation, intersectionality, interdisciplinarity, and collaborations in research with other faculty and students. The work of our faculty exemplifies cutting-edge scholarship that is directly responsive to issues that beset us in politics, culture, and health. As you will see in this video series, our faculty are collegial and collaborative, and they are deeply invested in the work of their colleagues, as the cross-departmental pairings of moderators and presenters in this series demonstrate. For more information on our college or any of the work featured in this series, write to us at hsh@uhcl.edu. And now, the College of Human Sciences and Humanities presents.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jeff Lash. I'm an associate professor of geography here at UHCL, and it's my honor to serve as moderator for the event. So welcome to tonight's presentation. Before we begin, a few notes. Microphones and cameras have been turned off. The event is being recorded, and immediately following the presentation, I'll give a brief response to the presenter's comments before opening up the event to questions and comments. To enter, use the chat within the Zoom to enter and record your questions or comments. All right. So now it's my pleasure to introduce a colleague in the College of Human Sciences and Humanities, Dr. Ann Gessler. Ann is a clinical assistant professor in the first-year seminar and humanities programs. She teaches across these disciplines as well as women's and gender studies and history. And she is the chair of the Common Reader program here at the university. She received her doctorate in American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin in 2015. Her teaching interests are many, and they include social movement history, women's and gender studies, media studies, animal studies, food studies, and utopian studies. Among her many accomplishments include this book, which we're happy to share with you tonight, Cooperatives in New Orleans, Collective Action and Urban Development. So according to the book jacket, it's a cultural history of the cooperatives driving New Orleans urban development. But for me, a geographer, it's much bigger than that. So the book sort of speaks to my academic soul, as it were, because it explores how people and the environment interact. More specifically, it's a book about how groups of people, communities, respond to changes in their local environment, the world in which their daily lives play out, right? It's about how communities respond to natural disasters and about how communities respond to changes in urban form as the result of unfair power politics. It's a fascinating book, and we're very lucky this evening to have Dr. Gessler speak to us about this important topic. So with that, Ann, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Lash. That was a wonderful introduction, and I'm so happy to be here. I hope I can live up to those beautiful words. I'm going to share my screen with you so you can, I can't share my screen, but that's okay. Just let the sound of my voice transport you back in time to my talk. So my talk is about the long civil rights movement and how it intersects with cooperatives in Louisiana and New Orleans specifically. Now I can, yay. Okay, so as Dr. Lash beautifully described, this is a sliver of a much larger project that's based on my book, Cooperatives in New Orleans, which talks about how laborers and women and immigrants and people of color created neighborhood cooperatives or worker-owned, democratically structured businesses and organizations to contribute to a grassroots social justice movement in New Orleans way back from the 1890s all the way toward to the present. So the book asks, are cooperatives a viable critique of markets and ownership, or are they just a temporary form of resistance limited by external political and economic forces? However, what I found was that for over 140 years, residents, particularly marginalized residents, have blended neighborhood communal traditions and survival strategies with global resistance tactics. So African, Caribbean, European cooperative principles to really democratize New Orleans. So they help preserve and expand spotty welfare programs and this crumbling infrastructure in order to envision a new place for themselves in their city and in their world. So the story that emerges is really one of both rupture and continuity. So from public kitchens and cooperative delis and ice cream parlors to community bike workshops and free schools, these very, very local cooperatives may be short-lived, they might not last a long time, but the concept of cooperation remains embedded in New Orleans' just everyday life. Cooperatives pop up again and again and again throughout history because they answer practical questions and needs for residents in order for them to stabilize their economic and political autonomy, particularly in times of crisis. So today my talk addresses how the long civil rights movement has shaped current New Orleans cooperatives. I'm going to start talking about one person in particular, Albert Dent, that's him on the left. And he was a Black hospital administrator for Flint Goodrich Hospital and then later became the president of Dillard University in New Orleans. I look at how he worked with multiracial New Deal Southern liberals, both white and Black, to establish a cooperative public health plan for Black Louisianans. And then I move on to talk about his son, who you can see on the right, that's Tom Dent. He kind of replicated, he mirrored these coalitional strategies that his father modeled. And he applied them to the 1960s era FreeSouthern Theater. This was a collective that was very experimental and it incorporated Black liberationist rhetoric, non-hierarchical collective structures, and an African diasporic spiritual and aesthetic practice to create this whole network of Southern Black-owned co-ops, not just performing arts co-ops, but agricultural co-ops, all sorts of co-ops throughout the South. And finally, I talk about how post-Hurricane Katrina, created lots of different racial justice co-ops that have continued to model these ideas, stretching back to the 1930s through Albert and Tom Dent, his son, and are still workable models for creating a robust regional economic network that has, again, driven New Orleans and Louisiana's development and labor policies and land use plans. All right, so I am going to stop sharing for a moment. So picture this. On April 14th and 15th, 1941, 140 Black and white Southern students, social workers, quote, dirt farmers, and workers for Uncle Sam eagerly convened in the Baton Rouge, desegregated Baton Rouge venue for the Southern Cooperative Educational Association's, quote, first biracial conference on cooperative education ever to be held in Louisiana. Students from the historically Black Southern University and what they termed a terrible works progress administrator soloist kicked off the conference with some light musical entertainment. Okay, so I'm setting the stage for you. Attendees listened to reports from a constellation of cooperatives before drafting action plans to assist labor, agricultural, and consumer cooperatives in their own states. As the conference organizers later observed, quote, cooperation comes by tasting, then biting into, and then reaching for more, then digesting, and then plowing and planting the neighborhood and the community fields where study plus work will bring results, end quote. So at the end of the conference, these organizers declared that the integrated body showed, great enthusiasm for, quote, cooperative responsibility in terms of security for oneself and one's brother. Dillard University's African-American president, Albert Dent, who you saw on that slide, was one of these enthusiastic cooperative converts. He was fresh from serving as an administrator of the segregated Flint Goodrich Hospital, and he championed consumer cooperatives that empowered ordinary Americans to seize control of their political and economic institutions. After studying cooperatives in an integrated committee of labor leaders, Highlander folk school supporters, and leftist Catholic priests, he pledged to, quote, actively promote purchasing cooperatives and consumer co-ops on Dillard campus. And he also was trying to promote cooperation and to promote the establishment of medical cooperatives in the New Orleans housing projects. His participation in this Southeastern Cooperative Association mirrored his activism within other integrated government and academic and professional coalitions. And they were all aiming to seize political and economic equality for Black people and for poor whites during the Depression. All the same, it's important to note that the stakes of cooperative building were very different for Black civil rights activists like Albert Dent than for his white Southern liberal colleagues. Bookended by the deprivation of the Great Depression and marginalized American and colonized peoples' mounting calls for community-led economic advancement after World War II, the Georgia-born Dent professionalized New Orleans cooperatives and integrated them within a regional and transnational social justice movement. Racial exclusion and everyday violence encouraged African Americans to continue to consider themselves as part of a collective, studying Black history, celebrating Black diasporic material culture, and debating their own racial destiny. So Dent was part of a groundswell of Black activists, from racial accommodationist Booker T. Washington to Pan-Africanist and integrationist W.E. Du Bois, and even Black nationalist Marcus Garvey. They all hailed cooperatives as an expedient means to construct a Black cooperative state that eliminated global capitalism grounded in racial exploitation. So similarly, in 1941 and 1942, Dent was finally elected to represent this Southeastern Cooperative Association as board of directors. And in doing so, he became part of a web of growing Black cooperative experts that were in favor of professionalized, institutionalized cooperative networks that were helping vulnerable Black Southerners. So while cooperatives, quote, promoted commercial and financial development of the Negro, end quote, they were also mechanisms to win full inclusion within American civil society and ultimately work out their own salvation as united people. So says Dent. So he started statewide mothers clubs, so providing nursing, cooperative nursing for rural Louisianans. He created an insurance plan that was cooperative, and he also created university-based consumer cooperatives that were changing and democratizing Black sociability patterns and even the fabric of the city's racial geography, and even an economic marketplace that at the time was very much weighted against Black citizens. So he foreshadows Black liberationist 1970s marriage of cooperative economics with political revolution. And he and his Southern colleagues believed that Black cooperatives, quote, offered a more fruitful way of living in this world until the requisite social changes materialized to renounce capitalism. Okay, that's pretty ambitious. So writer and playwright Tom Dent, so his son, took up his father's cooperative mantle 20 years later, and he incorporates Albert Dent's down-to-earth practical cooperative vision and coalition building strategies, and even his regional cooperative plan, into a very progressive, very leftist FreeSouthern Theater collective. So from the mid-1960s, when it was created, to its dissolution in 1982, the FreeSouthern Theater provided low-cost, politicized community theater and poetry workshops and creative writing workshops to New Orleans's poorest citizens. But that's not all they did. The FreeSouthern Theater also traveled throughout the South. They performed plays that featured local student activists and documented the civil rights struggle for Black audiences. Both Albert Dent, the father, and Tom Dent, the son, were rooted in a Southern cooperative movement that tried to reduce Black economic and political disempowerment within rural and urban communities. So you see this cooperative movement crossing generations, continuing the work from the 1930s and 40s into the 60s and 80s. However, again, it's important to note that they're not identical. They don't totally overlap in goals. Tom Dent and his compatriots combined militant communist organizational rhetoric and a non-hierarchical collective structure and African diasporic ideology into their co-op. Okay, so they were much more progressive, vocally progressive. And I'm going to talk about two moments in particular to show how the Free Southern Theater illustrates how its cooperative philosophy actually helped reshape the city and regional economies to, again, reduce structural inequality. So first, I'm going to talk about its relationship to Central City and its attempt to redevelop Central City in a more equitable way through Black-owned cultural institutions. And then secondly, I'll talk about its relationship with the Episcopal Church to create a network of Black co-ops across the city and the South, and even the nation. So to understand the extent of the Free Southern Theater's commitment to building a cooperative society, we have to understand its philosophical and aesthetic roots. Founders Doris Derby, John ONeill, and Gilbert Moses formed the Free Southern Theater in 1963 out of the Tougaloo Drama Workshop in Mississippi. And they were civil rights activists at the same time. They were members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. They were field directors working in Mississippi during 1964's Freedom Summer. And the collective was particularly influenced in structure and mission by Freedom Schools. Freedom Schools were proposed and developed by eventual Free Southern Theater champion and SNCC Field Secretary Charlie Cobb. And they were an alternative to segregated educational institutions, and they were meant to foster Black student civic engagement and community activism. These were volunteer-run schools that rejected hierarchical instruction, and they promoted student-centered learning based on discussion and critical thinking and leadership training. They were based in local community spaces such as churches and homes and parks. And you see this coming up in the way that the Free Southern Theater approached their programming and where they even staged their venues and their performances. So the Free Southern Theater actors lived with local Black families and civil rights activists while touring the South, so Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and Alabama. And they connected community theater with racial justice work. Their overall goal was to, quote, stimulate creative and reflective thought, end quote, in African Americans in Mississippi and across the South by establishing a theater that was accessible and meaningful to them, to Black audiences. So mirroring Albert Dent from the 1930s and 40s, mirroring his dedication to establishing a cooperative network that would help promote Black self-reliance and professional advancement, when the Free Southern Theater moved to New Orleans in 1964, it became dedicated to becoming a community-based incubator for local Black creative writers and performers in New Orleans specifically, but also across the South. Tom Dent, Albert Dent's son, and his fellow New Orleanians aligned the theater with the coalescing Black arts movement, which was infusing Black creative arts with radical politics. So 4 years later, by 1968, in line with SNCC's Black liberation ethic, the FST got rid of all its remaining white members. It was mostly completely Black membership, and it began performing Black authored plays by Black arts movement leaders, and as well as original Free Southern Theater work. So these new productions explored Black identity and strove to heighten their Black audience's self-awareness as politicized Black people. The sounds and images of their music and theater and creative writing projects recalled New Orleanian mutual aid societies and brass bands that were woven into working class Black social life. So for example, Tom Dent and his colleagues in the Free Southern Theater incorporated scenes from Mardi Gras and second line parades into their creative works. These Mardi Gras parades and second line musical parades were the central community events of many Black neighborhoods. So social aid and pleasure clubs, which are collectively organized, hold 2 regular parades a year, as well as funeral marches for their members. And member dues go toward coordinating these second line parades, which are themselves a ritualistic and cultural event and a network of reciprocity among members. The club hires a brass band and provides food, and for hours, parades will go for several miles through a specific neighborhood. And the brass band, if it's for a funeral, will play sad as well as celebratory music, while the club members will follow in beautifully coordinated matching suits. The second line is last, and these are community members who dance together, but also as the spirit moves them, which reveals the second line's ability to embrace both individual creative expression while solidifying community bonds. So the FreeSouthern Theater was very taken with these traditional modes of creative communal expression in the neighborhoods, and they adapted these traditions to their own cultural and educational programs because they believed and knew from living in New Orleans that these would help unite and educate and mobilize Black audiences to achieve what they called total independence and self-determination. What's also really important is the cooperative structure that was undergirding the FreeSouthern Theater's directives and programming and organization. So they had a permanent ensemble of 8 to 16 actors who were developing a collective method of theater work that would show to Black audiences as well as the world the liberatory potential of democratic decision-making to reshape society. So rather than depend on a manager and board of directors, all members participated in the theater's decision-making progress, either through group consensus or by committee. And members practiced collective remediation. They wrote together in group writing sessions, and they also equitably redistributed their roles. They also selected actors for their touring company based on their commitment to cooperative principles as well as Black liberation revolutionary goals. So they were already comfortable integrating local creative arts traditions into their works, but this became much more embedded by the late 1960s, in 1969, when the theater moved to Central City, which was a largely low-income Black neighborhood. And it encompasses a huge area. It stretches into the downtown central business district. It hits the Mississippi River, and it's also kind of sandwiched in between affluent and white uptown communities. So it's this big area that's kind of boxed in by affluence on either side. Over the 1950s and 60s, its demographics radically changed as white flight to the suburbs concentrated low-income Blacks within this neighborhood. So by the time the FreeSouthern Theater relocated and established its headquarters in Central City, nearly 7,000 neighbors, families lived in poverty. That's the largest number out of the city's most impoverished neighborhoods. And ironically, integration actually encouraged Black businesses to leave Central City in search for better markets. So by 1969, what once had been a bustling commercial district was now a disinvested, decaying neighborhood. So the FreeSouthern Theater was part of a group of Black progressive organizations that were trying to redevelop Central City in a democratic, egalitarian way. And Tom Dent describes this constellation of Black-run progressive stores and organizations that started moving in to Central City by the early 1970s. So he describes the bookstore down the street, the poetry journal, the activist and political newspapers, the beginning of a network of artists and activists. He describes the Nation of Islam that was, quote, attractive to many ex-movement people because of its philosophy of economic self-determination. He argues that the Central City world that he and the FreeSouthern Theater inhabited was part of, quote, a small Black cultural center, which helped provide a place where radical activities within a Black world could take place. And so all this foment, this social movement organizing was happening, again, in this, quote, Black world, where there were few white participants except for the most radical, he recalls. So again, they're not just operating in a vacuum, they're working with other collective nonprofits across the business sector and in the community theater community. So they're working with Dashiki Theater, which was run by Dillard University graduates, to, again, similar to the FreeSouthern Theater, provide Black cultural and political role models for neighborhood residents. So they'd actually hire residents to run theatrical productions, just like the FreeSouthern Theater. They exchanged members with the two groups, and they promoted each other's work to, again, foster this kind of collaborative network among residents themselves. So by creating a like-minded network of organizations producing Black theatrical plays and other cultural events, they, quote, helped encourage and support the revolutionary struggle of the Black nation in America and oppressed people throughout the world. Okay, so that is all concentrated in performing arts, right? But that wasn't just what the FreeSouthern Theater was interested in. They had a much broader vision of the role of cooperation in Black political and economic life. So they were also invested in creating a network of Black rural Southerners, a cooperative network of Black rural Southerners. So going all the way back to Albert Dent's coalitional work 30, 40 years prior with the Southern Cooperative Educational Association, they started collaborating with a range of co-ops across the South, all dedicated to providing economic and political stability to African Americans in rural communities. So they weren't just, they didn't have to be radical, they could be very moderate, civil rights oriented cooperatives, and they were part of this movement of anti-poverty activists and civil rights activists who believed that, as historian Greta DeJong says, that cooperatives were a solution to the poverty and dependence that African Americans had suffered within white-dominated economic systems. So, for example, FreeSouthern Theater worked closely with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives and Catholic priests throughout the South who were organizing cooperatives. And they subscribed to each other's newsletters, they exchanged members, they updated each other on their progress. And this was a big focus for the FreeSouthern Theater throughout the 1970s. This was really important because by the early 1970s, federal officials had largely ceased anti-poverty funding to Black community development. There was Nixon was in the White House, there was a new change in administration, a new focus. And so, desperate to fill the funding gap for their own operations and to support other cooperatives across the South, Black cooperatives, including the FreeSouthern Theater, started to appeal to religious organizations to fund their organizations. And interestingly, the Episcopal Church was a big funder of the FreeSouthern Theater and other minority-owned cooperatives. So they created an initiative called the General Convention of Special Programs to financially support the liberation struggles of oppressed people across the South. And they didn't care if you were particularly radical, but they really were invested in making sure that the cooperatives that they funded would spur marginalized communities' development and political empowerment. So the FreeSouthern Theater got a grant, and that really made them interested in working with the Episcopal Church even further to promote a regional network of cooperatives across Louisiana. So John ONeill, who was a member of the FreeSouthern Theater, started working closely with the Episcopal Church. And so he would go on these tours of the South to visit other Black-run co-ops and review their grant applications for the Episcopal Church. Truth be told, he preferred funding politically radical co-ops, but he would also recommend funding any cooperative that cared about community development and political engagement. So, for example, one of his applications, he recommended to fund the Grand Marie Vegetable Co-op, which was a sweet potato co-op. And that wasn't particularly radical, but it did provide a great deal of economic stability for its membership and was involved in voter drives. So he hoped that these cooperative businesses would create a political power vein, he said, for rural Southerners. So once they became economically stabilized and could vote, registered to vote, they could then attend to the larger project of societal transformation. So the Free Southern Theater ends in 1982, but their individual members remain dedicated to expanding this new moral economy rooted in Black community organizing. So they just didn't disappear. They remained very invested in New Orleans and Southern cooperative economics throughout the South. And this is very important because when Hurricane Katrina just slammed into New Orleans in August 2005, Black neighborhoods relied on that skeletal regional and local network that they had created 20, 30 years prior in order to help rebuild their communities in the face of this destruction from the flooding and the storm. So they were drawing on the same aesthetic traditions and mutual aid network that had originally inspired the Free Southern Theater to organize in Louisiana. So for new modern cooperative activists, Hurricane Katrina, its devastating winds and its flooding brutally exposed New Orleans' entrenched racial and class inequalities. So for the next 10 years, from 2005 to 2015, and to some extent today, neighborhood rebuilding was in tension, collided with city and federal efforts to privatize medical and housing and educational systems after the storm. And these privatization efforts that the city was spearheading were changing the shape of the city's physical and cultural fabric. Critics, these cooperative activists, were charging that city rebuilding efforts were primarily concentrating on improving the city's tourist and service industry. They were expanding shopping centers, they were rehabilitating tourist areas, they were, trying to redevelop the Mississippi riverfront. They weren't really thinking about rehousing the vulnerable residents who had been displaced by the floods to the extent that these critics wanted. So the city was drastically reducing its affordable housing stock, and that's significant because that is where performers and service workers who sustain the second lines, the Mardi Gras Indians, and all these parades, these mutual survival networks, that's where they live. So these housing projects were shrinking and displacement was a real problem. Gentrification was also an issue, and it was pushing rental prices, neighborhood rental prices, it was skyrocketing. Rental prices jumped 25% in the 10 years after Katrina because New Orleanians' average income was also a third lower than the national average. So housing stock, housing access was a real problem for New Orleanians' most marginalized residents. That's not to say they were defeated, though. Central City cooperative activists, just like 30, 40 years prior with the Free Southern Theater, they were at the forefront of public housing protests. So they teamed up with public housing organizers and argued that city boosters show a narrowness of vision when they promote the city's creative potential to tourists and to potential investors, while ignoring that performers who live in these affordable housing units can't really live off their creative efforts. In the years after Katrina, city administrators were conflating Black musicians with the criminal underground economy that was driving violence. They were falsely conflating these two groups. City officials would unceremoniously boot out musicians and performers in the French Quarter if they interfered with noise curfew violations. And musicians were very much aware of the connection between that kind of state surveillance and their shrinking housing and the gentrification that was slowly pushing them out of their traditional neighborhoods. Joel Dinerstein, who's a historian, calls this post-Katrina repression of second-line parades and Mardi Gras Indians and music in the French Quarter as aesthetic racism, because it threatens not only the creative expression of working-class Black communities, but the ability to even rebuild in these neighborhoods as well, as the housing stocks started shrinking even more. So cooperative activists understood that these second-line parades and these brass bands were part of this communal and musical performative tradition that could, again, reaffirm Black community bonds and help rebuild their political and social and economic survival networks. There's an entire cooperative, entrepreneurial, and social system of Black-owned bars and businesses that have emerged to support Mardi Gras parades and second line and brass bands, and they rely on that business to sustain themselves. Cooperative activists say that the most people you see at second lines and barbecue lines, on Monday, they're catering in a hotel. They want to get out of the hotel, they know what they want to do and who they want to do with it, and that's what they say cooperation is all about. So those are linked, cooperation, music, all of these are linked. So consequently, cooperative organizers easily recruited public housing residents who were dissatisfied with these tourists and service industry jobs, hospitality jobs. So music co-ops are mobilizing public housing and low-income residents against underemployment and affordable housing shortages and gentrification. In 2007, almost 5,000 public housing units were demolished. A coalition of community groups paraded in a second line and a brass band from City Hall to the St. Bernard Public Housing Project in peaceful protest. So they sang with the Hot 8 brass band, which is a very famous brass band there. They sang, "I need my home, we need our homes, don't take our home away." And the police broke up and arrested the demonstrators. But still, this indigenous form of protest, these indigenous cooperative institutions continue to operate as a significant site of Black working class resistance against these urban land use changes. I'm going to talk about one specific example. Rhythm Conspiracy shows how predominantly Black co-ops can help marginalized residents demand government services and help influence equitable neighborhood investment. And it's run by, let me show you her picture, Sally Stevens. She helped start this after Katrina. Here she is. Oop, now you can't see her anymore, but here she is. And it's also based in Central City. You see this legacy of Central City activism. She helps form Rhythm Conspiracy as a way to concentrate economic activity to reinvest Central City, the economy of the back into the Central City. So for example, she helps marginalized residents demand governmental services. She creates this cooperative to help legitimize public housing art and music while advocating affordable housing and job training. So it bridges these social aid and pleasure clubs that were often at the mercy of city surveillance with the national cooperative movement to advocate a living wage for city musicians. So she helps them circulate the profits within the communities. There's filmmakers and artists and dancers and theatrical performers. They're getting job training. They're learning about the aspects of the music business. They're booking their own shows. They're being their own agents. They're circulating the event proceeds among that cooperative membership so that the money stays within the city. It doesn't get exported to other venues outside so that they can make a living. And then the next step is to integrate with businesses and economic and workforce development organizations to institutionalize cooperatives so they don't seem so marginalized. And so Rhythm Conspiracy is trying to create a network of worker cooperatives that operate out of these public housing complexes, but will distribute federal resources and local resources to spur Central City's redevelopment. So she hopes, as Sally Stevens says, if, quote, significant cultural services and products are coming out of the most marginalized neighborhoods, they can't become gentrified in ways that similar neighborhoods are being gentrified in cities around the country. So in conclusion, I think it's really important to analyze the impact of these civil rights and social justice co-ops, the impact that they've had on the political and economic landscape of Louisiana, because they provide a model for current activists to design neighborhood-specific economic recovery and redevelopment. They offer a model that can be scaled and adapted to other locations, and provide a model for social change. So these veteran New Orleans cooperators are forming the backbone of a modern cooperative movement. They're firmly linking the current co-ops to the New Orleans legacy of civil rights and cooperative activism. And they form in the gaps between government assistance to help the people most in need. So I believe that studying these co-ops reflect how marginalized groups can create their own response to economic and political crises by melding working class communal traditions within the national and international cooperatives to fit that local context. Thank you very much.
All right, wonderful, Anne. Thank you. I'll let you take a breath and maybe a sip of water. At this point, I encourage all participants to use the question and answer or the chat function to submit questions, comments. I'll try and get to those and get some responses from Anne. So Anne, I'm going to ask you a question, just kind of build off what you ended up with there, and I'll give you a few minutes to think about a response, and I'll read a quote from your book. All right, so given what you said, are cooperatives temporary peaceful resistance, as you opened up with, or do they represent a sustainable policy model? And so while you're thinking about that, here in your book, you say, New Orleanian cooperative models address today's economic and political realities by illustrating how marginalized communities can collaboratively decide what cities should look like, how they should function, and whose economic interests they serve. So do cooperatives really do that? What do you think?
I think cooperatives are a really interesting model because they can be temporary and ephemeral while also providing opportunities for sustainable policy change. So what you see is that they pop up again and again and again, and people, as I showed, there's a generational legacy of cooperatives. So one of the drawbacks of cooperatives is that there's a lot of burnout and people leave the movement. But when they integrate with, they embed themselves in their community, when they work with governmental agencies and citizens that are less apt to just fall away, they can create a network for positive and prolonged change. So yes and no. Yes, I agree with both of your points. They're temporary, but they also can have lasting change.
All right. Are cooperatives egalitarian? So in your presentation, I got some sense that cooperatives wanted to embrace their culture, their place, their community, and celebrate that, while at the same time, those sort of cultural or ethical roots extend far beyond New Orleans. So then how do cooperatives sort of tread or straddle this line between representing the community and being able to represent similar struggles from other communities? How do you do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you see that kind of synthetic adaptation across the board. So in one of the, and that can cause a lot of friction. So in one of the co-ops that I don't talk about, but you have to read my book because I talk about it there. I talk about a white women's progressive cooperative that formed in the 1920s. A lot of non-New Orleanians formed that group. So you have a synthesis of ideas that are coming from outside New Orleans that are merging, but they're also adapting to the needs of that moment in that group. So there's a discussion, there's a conversation that makes sure that these external and internal ideas serve the community in need. So while the cooperative is very site specific, it's also engaging in conversation across borders, which I find fascinating.
Yes, and that gets me to this idea that geographers cling to, and that is scale. So how do you scale up the impact of a cooperative, or how do you increase the scale of sort of collecting ideas and movements? Where is there a sweet spot for how geographically extensive or expansive a cooperative is. And I guess this kind of leads to one of the questions, or one of the things we're sort of seeing here is, do these things work? Did they go on to become bigger and better? Did they just fade away? And does that have something to do with scale? Like at a particular scale, the idea really works, but move beyond a particular scale, beyond the scope of a neighborhood or a street, it just falls apart. And why would that be?
Okay, that's a beautiful question. There are lots of different co-ops that are both neighborhood based, but there's some that are national and international. Like if you've ever bought butter from Land O'Lakes, or if you've ever gone shopping at REI, which is an outside outfitter shop, those are cooperatives. So you can have literally a street-based co-op, or you could have a national cooperative. So they do scale up. There is a debate about how to balance, how to work together. So if you're an anarchist cooperative, you might like I keep saying constellation, but it really is a constellation of co-ops that are just loosely configured around a like-minded goal of egalitarian, non-hierarchical decision-making. So they don't really work there's no uniformity, but there's a general consensus, and they kind of check in with each other. So it's this loose network. Or if you're like the cooperative organization that I was talking about at the beginning of my talk, the Southeastern Educational Cooperative Association, they're very invested in a very uniform, let's all have the same idea, let's roll it out at the same time, everyone should be on the same page. And so there's debate about how to scale it up. What should it look like? Is it more sustainable if it's more a loosey-goosey, everyone do their same everything? Or should we have this particular model that is then instantiated in, kind of enforced or put upon different neighborhoods at different times? Yeah. Sometimes those work, sometimes they don't work. Yeah.
Right. What if your neighborhood, and this question draws on a question submitted by an attendee, what if the neighborhood is the internet? So as a community, anybody logged in becomes part of a community. So how might, if there is such a thing, a virtual cooperative, and how does a virtual cooperative change maybe the thinking about what a cooperative is or where it is effective? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great idea. A cooperative doesn't have to be a business. They don't have to be profiting off of anything. They could be a collective of ideas. So they could be like a self-study group, or they're just promoting a certain ideology. So yeah, you could have a collective that either that is based on that's based around the internet. You could totally do that. As a side note, cooperatives are very internet savvy, and they're using social media to expand the borders of their co-op. So you'll see on Twitter, there's a very active cooperative scene where people are promoting ideas that way. And so you can be affiliated with people all over the world through your social media presence, which totally expands the scope of what a cooperative could look like.
Right. So in geographical terms, what we're talking about here is kind of space and place. And I know you're sort of aware of those. And I'd like you to react to one of my sort of favorite things to think about. Yifu Tuan, famous sort of cultural geographer, has said that, thinking about spaces and places, and how do you differentiate between those, and how those terms then become part of a cooperative's identity. Right. And so he said, I like this, I'll let you sort of digest this. Place is security and space is freedom. We are attached to the one and are longing for the other. So in the sense of the cooperatives you looked at, does that ring true? Is there an element of truth there?
Absolutely. I mean, most of the co-ops I'm talking about operate within a segregated city. And so place and space are not the same. And so in a segregated landscape, it could be almost impossible for a cooperative to meet together if they're integrated. The Southeastern educational cooperative association that I talked about at the beginning, they were literally wringing their hands with worry that they would alienate their white membership if they integrated their cooperative. And in fact, credit unions, which are cooperative banks, there are oral histories that have talked about their Black members who are official members of that group having to sit outside of a meeting space, a place that is segregated, and wait for a white member to come out and explain what happened at that meeting because they didn't think to hold that at an integrated space. So the segregated place can shape the reality of collaboration, interracial collaboration in a very real way. And so you might have the idea of integration and integration of ideas, but if the place doesn't allow you to socialize and exchange ideas, then it's going to be very limited.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I'm kind of in the thinking of the interest of time here and want to raise one other question for you. And again, it's a hallmark of geographic inquiry, and that is field work. Getting out there into the world, talking with people, seeing it, feeling it, tasting it, hearing it. Can you just describe a little bit of the field work you did and what, if any, impact that had on your understanding of cooperatives?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll show you back on my case studies. Here we go.
You're not going to show us the map, are you?
I'm
Oh,
gonna show you the map.
yes. All right, great.
Yeah, I did oral histories, so ethnographic field work. I interviewed about 20 practicing cooperatives. I also did archival research to find co-ops across the city. So I was looking at, newspaper advertisements announcing their meetings or meeting minutes. I spent 2 years, about a month or 3 months at a time during the summer, during my doctoral research in New Orleans. Sometimes I would just ride my bike up and down the street looking for a cooperative, and I found a lot that way actually. And then I'd go talk to them. They'd introduce me to other cooperative members, and so I found a very lively network of co-ops that were also very aware of their history. So I was doing archival research, I was doing oral history projects, I was driving around, taking pictures, finding the ghosts of cooperatives past, but also how they're influencing the present.
Mm-hmm. And related to that, we have another question here that sort of talks about or is looking for specifics. What are the specific elements that can transfer? So from these cooperatives, if we want to think about scaling it up or moving it across town, did you see examples during your field work? Did you hear people talking about something outside of New Orleans that originated in New Orleans? Where there's that sort of migration of ideas. Can you speak to that?
Yes, great question. So on the one hand, depending on what kind of cooperative model you follow, so for example, the Rochdale cooperative model, you have a set list of 10 principles that all co-ops, regardless if they're in New Orleans or the Netherlands or wherever they are, have to follow. So they have 10 guiding principles. For example, every member, regardless if they're fantastically wealthy or they have no money to their name, get a vote in the decision-making process of the cooperative. So there's 10 lists of principles that guides the co-op. On the other hand, yes, New Orleans co-ops are very much part of the international cooperative scene. In fact, just in July, the USDA reconvened a committee on studying marginalized farmers, and the chair of that committee that helps create policy for the USDA is a Louisianan cooperative member, Harvey Reid, and he's actually the subject of the last chapter of my book. He helps direct federal policy, making sure that marginalized farmers and ranchers aren't shut out of federal grants. And that's really important right now during COVID, when a lot of farmers are seeing their profits just shrink. And so he is guiding that policy, which I find great, fascinating.
So with just maybe about 4 or 5 minutes left here, And building on your last comment there about, the application of these cooperative models to current events. So for you as a scholar, sort of what's next? Are you going to follow these cooperatives and now that line of thinking? Has it led you to a new topic or a new city or a new geography? What's next?
That's a great question. Yes, I'm sure that any researcher has a whole list of folders on their computer that's like, next projects, shelved projects that they didn't get to do. I have lots of little baby projects that are offshoots of this research. For example, I'm really interested in women's organizing, cooperative organizing in Louisiana, and again, the legacy of this co-op movement. To go back to one of the questions you asked about what constitutes a failure, what constitutes a success. One thing that utopian studies scholars have argued is that you can't measure a co-op by its longevity. If you do that, you'll just think everything's a failure. So it's really how they're meeting their needs. And so I'll be studying women's cooperative work, not just in that particular co-op that didn't last very long, but how they extended forward and their legacy on civil rights and women's activism into the 1950s. So like a 30-year intergenerational cooperative movement.
All right. So we'll get you signed up for another HSH Presents presentation after you've wrapped up all those studies.
Thank you.
So listen, this has been fabulous. It's been my pleasure again as sort of a geographer to sort of find your work and be able to connect with your work a little bit more. It's been a fascinating sort of introduction to your world. So I appreciate you taking the time with us tonight.
Thank you.
All right. And to all of you out there in the audience, we certainly appreciate your attendance tonight. This is the first of a series of HSH Presents presentations. So I think we have the next presentation coming up, February 8th at 6 p.m., Definitions of Diversity and Their Impact on Creating Culturally Responsive Learning Environments. Two speakers, an associate professor of social psychology, Desi Rios, and Amy Lucas, an associate professor of sociology. So I hope in a few weeks that you'll come back and join us for the second installment of the HSH Presents lecture series. So thank you all very much for joining us this evening, and have a great rest of your week.